Number 17, we're looking for an assumption required by the argument. So let's see if we can find any holes in the argument. The argument says that in order to establish a human colony on Mars, we'd have to assemble tremendous quantities of basic materials at the site of that colony on Mars. But because the costs of transporting these materials through space would be extremely high, therefore, conclusion, it's not going to be economically feasible to colonize Mars. Very simple argument, right? But there really are two assumptions here. If you're keeping score, if you're paying really close attention to the paragraph, there's a couple things being assumed. And another way of putting that is there's two variable shifts in this argument. What do I mean by that? They shifted from having quantities of basic materials on Mars to transporting those materials to Mars, right? And they shifted from cost being so high to not being economically feasible. Let me just go in a little more depth into both of those two assumptions. On the one hand, we said that in order to do this, we're going to need to assemble all these basic materials at that colony in Mars. And then we said, oh, but transporting it through space to Mars is going to be too expensive. Well, who says you have to transport it through space? Maybe they already exist on Mars, right? So that's an assumption. The assumption is that you have to transport it to space. What if you could just dig it up? What if it already exists on the planet of Mars? In which case, it doesn't matter that transporting these materials would be so expensive, right? So maybe that's the case. We clearly are assuming that that's not the case. We're clearly assuming that the only way to get those materials there is to transport them through space, and therefore that's why that proves that it's not economically feasible, because the cost of doing that would be so high. That's one assumption. The other jump was, okay, well, just because the cost would be so high, quote unquote, doesn't mean it's not going to be economically feasible to colonize Mars, right? A very high cost might be justified economically by an even higher profit or return on investment. So we're assuming that even though that cost is so high, it's not going to be, or rather I should say, we're assuming that because the cost is so high, it's not going to be worthwhile. It's not going to be economically feasible, right? We're assuming that there aren't even greater amount of economic benefit that we're going to get that's going to more than offset that high cost. We're assuming that that's not the case, and therefore the fact that the cost is so high proves that it's not economically feasible, because not economically feasible implies that it doesn't pay. It's not a good idea economically. We're not going to make back our investment. So we're assuming that we're not going to make back our investment due to the high cost of transporting those materials. So again, two assumptions that we can look for in the answer choices, two really subtle holes in this argument. First of all, there was the jump from the materials having to be there and therefore assuming that they have to be transported through space, that they're not already on Mars. And second of all, there's the assumption that because the cost of that transportation through space is so high that we're not going to recoup that investment, that makes it economically unfeasible. So let's look for something that expresses one of those assumptions in the answer choices, or maybe some third assumption that, who knows, that maybe we didn't think of. But let's look for something that expresses a missing assumption in this argument. We have to be really careful because some of these answers are going to be written in a little bit of a tricky way. So we have to be very precise here. And let's notice that the question is asking for a necessary assumption. Which of the following is an assumption that is required by the argument? And we always have our litmus test for necessary assumptions. So let's see what that's going to look like as we look at the answers. A is a little tricky. Do we have to assume A, that only if the cost of this transportation of materials from Earth to Mars, only if that cost decreases, will humans colonize Mars? Now, here's the thing. The conclusion of the argument is not about whether this will happen or not. Let's pay very close attention to what the conclusion is saying. The conclusion is not a prediction about whether we will colonize Mars or whether we won't colonize Mars. The conclusion that we are trying to prove in this argument is that it won't be economically feasible to colonize Mars. Now, whether or not something's economically feasible might not be equivalent to whether or not it will be done. People do economically unfeasible things all the time, right? Just because something is done doesn't mean it's economically feasible. It could be that we'll say, it could be that we won't know that it's economically unfeasible and we'll just put the whole human species into a great debt and it'll just be a total mistake and we'll do it anyway. But even though it was really economically unfeasible and we didn't realize that, right? So A is more of a prediction about whether it will be done. A is saying the only way it'll ever be done is if the cost of transporting materials from Earth to Mars decreases. Okay, but that doesn't have to be assumed. Let's do our litmus test. Even if A were false, right? When you're dealing with necessary assumptions, that means if you make A false, assuming A is the right answer, if it's really a necessary assumption, that means if you make it false, the argument should fall apart. So let's say we make A false. Let's say, no, even if the cost does not decrease, human habitation still might be established on Mars. That doesn't ruin the argument, because even if it might happen, the argument might still be true, which is that, yeah, but it's going to be economically unfeasible. People are going to be reckless, they're going to do it anyway, but it's still economically unfeasible. So even if you make A false, the argument might still hold, and therefore it's not a necessary assumption that has to be made. B is a little bit tricky. Do we have to assume that the cost of the transportation of these materials through space that we talked about in the paragraph as being so high, do we have to assume that that's not expected to decrease coming up in the near future? Now, here's the thing. We actually don't need to assume that, because even if it does decrease in the near future, it still might be way too high, right? The paragraph is saying it would be such a high price. Even if it decreases a little bit in the future, it still might be way too high so as to be economically feasible, right? And another way of stating that is, let's apply our litmus test. Let's make B false and see if that ruins the argument. Because if it does, then it's a necessary assumption. If not, then it's not, right? Let's say the cost of transporting basic materials through space is expected to decrease in the near future. Let's say it is expected to decrease by 1% or by 5% or by 20%. It still might be too high to be economically feasible. So it still doesn't necessarily ruin the argument. The argument might still hold even if B is false. Well, if that's the case, then that means B is not something that necessarily has to be assumed, which means it's not an assumption required by the argument, which means it doesn't answer the question. C is a little tricky. Do we have to assume that Earth is the only source of these basic materials that we would need to establish human colonization on Mars? So who said anything about Earth being the source of these materials, right? The paragraph just said that the cost of transporting these materials through space would be so high. Who said that we're assuming that we're transporting them from Earth? Maybe we're assuming that we're transporting them from Venus, right? We literally have no idea. It doesn't say, right? So C is not something that has to be assumed for this argument to work. Now, it's a little tricky because we do have to assume that it's not already on Mars, right? Because we are assuming that there's some transportation needed, right? We mentioned that when we broke down the paragraph. But we're not necessarily assuming that that transportation is coming from Earth, right? Maybe we can assume that it could come from Earth or Venus or Jupiter. Maybe there's other sources of these basic materials as well, right? But clearly, we're assuming that Mars is not a sufficient source, right? So let's apply our litmus test just to prove this 100%, hit the nail in the coffin. If we make C false, that's not going to ruin the argument, which proves that it's not a necessary assumption. If we make C false, if we say that Earth is not the only source of these materials, maybe we could also get them from Venus, maybe they also exist on Pluto, maybe they also exist in other galaxies, but they just happen to not exist on Mars, then that would not ruin this argument, right? Unless they exist on Mars, then this argument still stands that we have to transport them to Mars, and therefore C is not something that necessarily has to be assumed when we think about it very precisely. D, do we have to assume that there would be no significant benefit that would result from us establishing human habitation on Mars? So no, we actually don't have to assume that, because maybe there would be significant benefit. That wouldn't prove whether it's economically feasible or not, right? The argument is trying to prove, we're trying to conclude that it would not be economically feasible. Okay, maybe there would be significant benefit from doing it. It just wouldn't be enough benefit to make it economically feasible, right? So maybe if I, spend $500 on a day at the spa and I get all kinds of, massages and treatments, maybe there will be significant benefit from that. Maybe I'll feel really good. But that doesn't mean that it was economically feasible to do that. Maybe I couldn't afford it. Maybe I didn't have the $500. Maybe it was a terrible mistake that I did that, right? So whether significant benefit would result doesn't prove that it's economically feasible. Also, who knows if it's an economic benefit? Like in my example, it wasn't even an economic benefit. So maybe it was economically not feasible, but it was emotionally still, the right thing to do in terms of what I wanted to do, right? So we're trying to argue whether something's economically feasible. That means the economic benefit is going to outweigh the economic downside, right? Or in this case, we're arguing that it's not going to do so, right? So in other words, all this is to say that even if D is false, which let's make D false, let's assume that there is a significant benefit that would result from establishing human colonization of Mars. Let's say there's all kinds of benefits. We'll be able to send humans to Mars when Earth gets overcrowded or something. I don't know. Maybe there's going to be a bunch of benefits that come from that. That doesn't mean that the conclusion is false. Even if D is false, the conclusion still might be true that yes, even though there would be all that significant benefit, it's still not economically feasible. We still can't afford to do it. Yes, in a perfect world, sure, we'd have that significant benefit, but it's still not a good idea economically. So the conclusion might still hold even if D were false, which proves that D is not Precisely speaking, it's not a necessary assumption. It's not something that has to be assumed for this argument to work. Let's read E carefully. E says that we have to assume that Mars itself is not a practical source of these basic materials that would be required for colonizing humans there. We do have to assume that, right? That was one of the two things we mentioned when we broke down the paragraph. We have to assume that those materials are not already there. We have to assume that they have to be transported through space. The whole argument is saying transporting them through space would be way too expensive. And so therefore it's not going to work. Well, you're assuming that you have to transport them through space. In other words, you're assuming that Mars itself doesn't already have those materials that you need. In other words, you're assuming E, that Mars itself is not a practical source of these materials that are required, right? And to apply our litmus test, if we make a necessary assumption false, if it's truly a necessary assumption and we make it false, that would ruin the argument. Well, if we make E false, let's say that Mars is, just take out the word not, just delete that word from E. Let's say Mars is a practical source of these materials required for colonizing it. Well, then that would ruin the argument, because then all of a sudden we don't have to transport it through space, and then therefore the whole argument falls apart because the whole argument rests on the fact that it's so expensive to transport these things through space. Therefore, E is exactly what we're looking for. It is one of the necessary assumptions for this argument, so it's the correct answer. Kind of a tricky question. If you found this video useful, don't forget to hit subscribe. And for thousands more clear LSAT explanation videos, go to masterlsat.com.